Okay, let's dive into a stack of sources today that pull us into some really complex territory. We're looking at articles covering global diplomacy, legal frameworks, and pretty fundamental science, and even how we, experience urban space.
Yeah, quite a mix. And our goal, as always, is to cut through the noise, find the core insights, and maybe highlight some surprising details from this varied material.
Exactly. It's interesting how these different areas, international relations, law, even physics, grapple with their own intricate rules and, well, the challenges that pop up when reality doesn't quite fit the established framework.
That's a great way to put it. We're going to explore some of those collisions today, starting with a couple of pieces from the editorial section.
Right. First up, an editorial looking critically at global diplomacy, focusing specifically on India, Pakistan, and the challenge of terrorism. The author makes a pretty strong case here.
They do. The main argument is that, from India's perspective at least, traditional diplomacy, both bilateral and multilateral, often feels, well, futile when dealing with Pakistan on issues like terrorism and Kashmir.
Futile because.
Why exactly?
Because, as the author puts it, these efforts get caught in this entangled web of frozen ideas. They argue it's not just about today's issues, but historical events, even going back to the Cold War, have created these really entrenched positions and international frameworks that are just incredibly hard to shift now.
Wow. And you see that even in something basic like maps.
Yeah, that's a specific example they use, UN maps and literature about the India-Pakistan border. They often have these disclaimers, right, like dotted line represents approximately a line of control, or the final status of Jammu and Kashmir has not yet been agreed upon.
Which, even if meant to be neutral.
Exactly. Even if intended as neutral, it makes it harder for India to simply assert J&K as an integral, settled part on the world stage. The author suggests Pakistan can kind of use these unresolved elements and UN resolutions as a bit of a smokescreen, to keep internationalizing the Kashmir issue.
Okay. And then there's the whole problem of defining terrorism itself globally. India tried to push for a UN convention, didn't they? They did, yeah, decades ago. A comprehensive convention against terrorism. But it stalled. And the core reason highlighted is that fundamental problem. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter.
It's subjective.
Highly subjective. The article even points to India's own history, supporting certain anti-colonial fighters in Africa or Sri Lanka to show how complex that labor can be depending on context and perspective.
So even 9/11, which seemed like such a defining moment.
Didn't actually lead to a universally agreed legal framework. The author notes the focus, particularly from the U.S., shifted more towards, well, military action, like in Afghanistan, rather than building a global legal consensus.
So what is the UN Security Council's approach now? It seems limited for India's concerns.
It does have limitations. It relies mainly on resolutions that put obligations on states' economic measures, security steps. There's a counterterrorism committee monitoring things. And for actual attacks, there's Article 51 of the UN Charter, the right to self-defense.
But using Article 51 for attacks by non-state groups, especially across borders, that's tricky.
Very tricky in practice. The article suggests actions like India's surgical strikes, framed as self-defense, get judged under international law by things like proportionality. It's not a straightforward green light, especially when the attack originates from another state's territory but isn't directly carried out by state forces.
Right. And the Security Council's wider approach focusing on whole of society, human rights, addressing root causes, countering violent extremism.
While important goals, that broad approach doesn't easily give India the clear endorsement it might seek for treating a major terrorist attack purely as an act of war by the other state involved. It complicates that narrative.
The author also mentions this hyphenation thing.
Yeah, briefly. How historically India and Pakistan often got linked on issues like nuclear weapons, partly because the Kashmir issue was initially framed at the UN under Pacific settlement rules rather than aggression. It all adds layers.
It paints a picture of diplomacy really boxed in by history and legal language.
It does. And that leads the author to a stark conclusion. Maybe India gains little by constantly internationalizing these concerns, given how entangled they are. They suggest focusing more on military security might be necessary if Pakistan's policies continue, implying diplomacy has hit a wall in this specific dynamic. It's a tough read on the limits of those global frameworks.
Definitely. Okay, shifting gears but sticking with complex frameworks. Let's look at the second editorial. This one defends India's new rules for foreign lawyers, the Bar Council of India, or BCI, rules against criticism, particularly from some U.S. firms.
Right, another example of domestic rules meeting global practice. These BCI rules came in last May, and they basically allow foreign firms to operate in India, but under pretty specific conditions.
And the pushback from some U.S. firms was quite strong, calling them barriers designed to exclude.
Yeah, terms like non-trade barrier and deliberate move to exclude were used. Their main complaints involved procedural hurdles, feeling their input wasn't heard, and a big one was client confidentiality.
Ah, the confidentiality point. What was the specific issue there?
The rules required disclosing the nature of legal work and client identity. U.S. firms argued this clashes directly with American Bar Association rules protecting client confidentiality.
Okay, that does sound like a potential conflict. What else?
They also took issue with the fly-in, fly-out rules for short visits. The 60-day limit per year and the disclosure needs felt inconsistent, they argued, because Indian lawyers visiting the U.S. don't face identical restrictions. They also felt it was sprung on them without warning and could even hurt U.S.-India trade by limiting access to U.S. legal advice within India.
So, quite a list of complaints, but this author pushes back hard, calls it a reality check.
They do. The core counter-argument is that the critics misunderstand the BCI's role and how law is viewed in India. First, the BCI isn't about trade promotion. It's a statutory body setting professional standards, right?
Right, regulating the profession.
Exactly. And second, crucially, practicing law in India is constitutionally seen as separate from trade. It's under different list entries related to courts and practitioners, not commerce. They cite a recent Supreme Court case, Jasbir Singh Malik, reinforcing law as a personal service, not a trade activity.
And India's been consistent on this, like with the UK trade deal.
Precisely. They deliberately excluded legal services from the UK-India FTA, so this is not of the blue. The author argues the BCI rules aren't a barrier, but actually a liberalization they allow foreign firms in, subject to registration and rules. The 60-day fly-in limit is part of that structured opening.
So, controlled entry, not exclusion. What about the reciprocity argument, the idea that it's unfair compared to Indian lawyers in the U.S.?
The author flips that. They point out Indian lawyers face tough state-by-state licensing in the U.S. So for reciprocity to mean equivalence, U.S. lawyers wanting to operate in India must also comply with India's regulatory framework. These rules, they argue, create that equivalence. They don't undermine it.
Okay. And the practical issue of getting a good standing certificate from the U.S. system.
The author acknowledges that's tricky due to the U.S.'s decentralized system, but says that's a U.S. issue, not India's fault. And they note, BCI Rule 6 gives flexibility for case-by-case verification if a standard certificate isn't possible.
And back to the confidentiality concern, the disclosure requirement.
The article clarifies the intent isn't to breach specific client privilege. It's about getting general info like, are you doing arbitration or M&A advice? To ensure firms stay within the permitted scope of practice for foreign lawyers in India. It's about oversight of the type of work.
So the author sees these rules as a bridge, not a wall.
Yes, a cooperative bridge is the phrase used, for measured liberalization, balancing foreign entry with protecting the integrity of the Indian legal system, reciprocity, and accountability. It's a fascinating clash between domestic regulation and global service trade.
Absolutely. Okay, let's jump from legal frameworks to something completely different. We're heading into the science section now, looking at an article about pinning down the mass of the neutrino, these incredibly elusive particles, using the Cochrane experiment in Germany.
And this story starts with just an amazing illustration of the scale involved, the main detector for Cochrane, this huge 200-ton spectrometer.
Right, I read that it couldn't just be trucked a few kilometers.
No, it had to take this massive 8,600-kilometer detour by boat, Danube, Black Sea, Mediterranean, Atlantic, Rhine, all because it was too big for bridges and tunnels. Only the last 7 kilometers were by road. That journey alone tells you something.
It really does. So why this massive effort for tiny neutrinos? What's the puzzle?
The biggest puzzle is their mass. We actually know they have mass. That discovery won the 2015 Nobel Prize. It was shown by particle oscillations.
Which is when they change flavor or type as they travel?
Exactly. And that can only happen if they have mass. And the different types have slightly different masses. But the problem is, oscillation experiments only tell us the difference between the squares of their masses, not the actual mass itself.
Oh, okay. So we know they have mass, but not how much. And that's where Cochrane comes in.
Precisely. And measuring it is incredibly hard because neutrinos are, as the article says, unbearably light. They travel near light speed and barely interact with anything. Think about this. You'd need a light year of lead to stop half the neutrinos from the sun.
Wow. A light year of lead. That's hard to imagine. No wonder they were hard to find.
Yeah, and this fact that they do have mass, however small, creates a huge problem for our best theory of particles, the Standard Model.
Because the Standard Model predicts they should be massless.
Exactly. Which is why physicists are so interested. It's one of the strongest signs that there must be new physics, maybe new forces or particles, beyond the Standard Model that give neutrinos their mass.
There's also this other question, right? Whether they're their own antiparticles.
Yes, that's another big mystery. They're neutral, they seem elementary. If they're their own antiparticles, they're called Majorana particles.
Yeah.
If not, they're Dirac particles like electrons. Figuring this out is key. One potential way is looking for something called neutrinoless double beta decay, a super rare event where basically two neutrinos would cancel each other out if they were Majorana.
Okay. But Catron's approach is different. It doesn't assume they're Majorana.
Correct. Catron looks at the plain old beta decay of tritium, a heavy hydrogen isotope. When tritium decays, it emits an electron and an antineutrino. Catron precisely measures the energy of millions of these emitted electrons right near their maximum possible energy.
How does that tell you the neutrino mass?
Because if the antineutrino has mass, it carries away some energy, slightly lowering the maximum possible energy the electron can have. By measuring that endpoint of the electron energy spectrum super accurately, they can put a limit on the neutrino's mass.
And they have a new result.
They do. A new upper limit on the sum of the masses of the three neutrino types. It's now constrained to be no more than 8.8 times 10 to the minus 7 times the mass of an electron. That's roughly twice as stringent as the previous best direct limits from way back in 1991.
But the article notes other methods like cosmology give even tighter limits.
They do. Looking at how neutrinos shape the early universe suggests a limit maybe 6 times tighter. But, and this is crucial, those cosmological limits depend on assumptions about cosmology, about the early universe, which are hard to test directly. Experiments looking for neutrinoless double beta decay also make an assumption that neutrinos might be Majorana.
So the power of the Catron result is its robustness.
Exactly. It's a direct lab measurement. It doesn't rely on those big cosmological models or assumptions about the neutrino's fundamental nature. It's just an incredible feat of engineering and physics trying to grasp these fundamental cosmic mysteries.
Amazing stuff. Okay, from the incredibly small to the complexities of statecraft, let's move to the tech section. First up, an analysis of Turkish President Erdogan's foreign policy described as assertive, blending Islamist ideology with pragmatism.
Yeah, this piece really digs into a major shift in Turkey's approach to the world. It contrasts Erdogan's policy-building ties with Muslim nations, projecting regional power, often using Islamist connections with the older, more inward-looking West-aligned policy established by Ataturk.
Ataturk's peace at home, peace in the world.
Right, which mostly held for decades. This article traces the roots of Erdogan's approach back to older ideas, like the late Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II's concept of Ittihadi Islam-Muslim unity against Western influence, and also the influence of Necmettin Erbakan, an earlier Islamist leader whose movement Erdogan's AKP party grew out of. Erbakan pushed for closer Muslim ties and was wary of the West, even calling the EU a Christian club.
And this really came to the fore after the Arab Spring.
Definitely. The article argues Erdogan saw the uprisings as a huge opportunity for this kind of Neo-Ottoman Islamist-influenced foreign policy. He openly backed protesters, supported groups like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and various anti-Assad groups in Syria, including Islamist ones like HPS. His foreign minister at the time even talked about breaking the old Sykes-Picot borders.
But it's described as assertive yet pragmatic. It's not purely ideological then.
That's the key point the author makes. Erdogan knows Turkey isn't the Ottoman Empire anymore. It's a NATO member, hosts Western bases. So while he pushes boundaries, supports groups that might worry allies, he stops short of a complete break. It's about using these connections, especially in the Muslim world, as a tool to boost Turkey's influence.
Can you give some examples of this balancing act?
Sure. Syria is a prime example. Turkey protects HTS in Idlib, cuts deals with Russia, but also uses military force to create buffer zones against Syrian Kurds. The recent HTS takeover in Damascus is seen as boosting Turkey's standing. Then there's the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict in 2023. Turkey backed Azerbaijan heavily with drones against Armenia, which is closer to Russia.
And the whole Russia-US dynamic, too.
Right. Selling drones to Ukraine while refusing sanctions on Russia, buying Russian S-400 missiles, which infuriated the U.S., then leveraging support for Sweden and Finland joining NATO to get concessions from Washington. It's very transactional, playing different sides.
The article mentions domestic challenges as well. The economy.
Yes, it calls the economy high inflation, the weak lira Turkey's Achilles heel. It also mentions social unrest and increasing authoritarianism, changing the constitution, cracking down on opposition like arresting the Istanbul mayor.
So the overall takeaway is uncertain.
Pretty much. The author concludes that while these assertive foreign policy moves have scored some tactical wins, it's unclear if they lead to long-term strategic gains. There's instability in places like Syria, mistrust in the Gulf, the constant balancing act required, and Turkey is still not a major player in, say, South Asia. The risk, the author warns, is that this path, combined with domestic problems, could lead to Turkey becoming an authoritarian Islamist regime with a weak economy and political instability. It highlights the real risks of this ambitious strategy.
A very complex picture indeed. Okay, for our final piece, also from the text section, we're shifting perspectives dramatically to think about space itself, not outer space, but the spaces we live in. This article explores Edward Soja's concept of third space.
Yeah, this is a really fascinating idea that changes how you might see your own neighborhood. Soja, building on Henri Lefebvre, argues space isn't just the physical stuff around us or how planners design it. It's also profoundly shaped by our lived experiences, our memories, identities, even our resistance.
The idea that space is something that lives in us, I liked that phrase.
Me too. And it's where everyday life plays out, often with contradictions, and where marginalized groups often find ways to assert themselves. Think about those informal ethnic neighborhoods the article mentions, like a Chinatown or Afghan Street.
Not on the official map that way, but everyone knows them.
Exactly. They're created and defined by the community living there. That's a glimpse of third space. Soja developed this from Lefebvre's spatial triad, calling it the trialectics of spatiality.
Okay, so what are the three parts of this trialectic?
First, there's first space. That's the physical material space you can measure and map roads, buildings, parks. It seems neutral, but its layout often reflects power, where slums are, where different communities cluster. It's the Wasa space.
Got it. Then second space.
That's the conceived space, the ideological layer. How space is imagined, planned, and controlled by power planners, governments, developers. Think blueprints, zoning laws, master plans. It reflects ideas about how space should be used, who it's for. Often includes biases like labeling areas commercial or implicitly unsafe. Colonial maps imposing order or gentrification plans are examples.
And third space blends these with lived reality.
Precisely. Third space is the lived space. It's where people actually exist, remember, interact, resist, make meaning. It combines first and second space, but goes beyond them. It's infused with emotion, identity, culture, politics. It can't be fully planned or mapped. The refugee colony example is great, planned as housing, first, second, but lived as a vibrant cultural hub with markets, music, food, transforming it through community action, third space.
And it's fluid, changing, and especially important for marginalized groups.
Yes, because it's often in these lived spaces that dominant narratives or plans are challenged or subverted. It's where women, migrants, minorities might carve out safety, community, or express identity. The article connects this to feminist geography, how space feels different based on gender, for example, and ideas like bell hooks, seeing the margin as a site of resistance.
Soja focused on cities, but it applies elsewhere too, like a village square.
Absolutely. A village square is physical, first space.
Yeah.
Might be conceived as the traditional heart, second space. But its third space is how people actually use it, the memories attached, the social interactions, maybe even subtle challenges to tradition that happen there.
But cities are where these tensions are maybe most visible.
That's why Soja emphasized them. Cities have intense planning and control, second space, overlaid on dense physical structure, first space. But they're also where diverse people collide, informal economies pop up, protests happen, all expressions of third space bubbling up, the Greenwich Village example, physical streets first, historic district plans, second. But its third space is the deep cultural meaning tied to LGBTQ plus history, Stonewall, pride, counterculture, resistance.
It feels like a way to value the messy human reality of places, not just the plans.
Exactly. It corrects an over-reliance on just the mappable or quantifiable. It includes the graffiti, the street performers, the way people feel in a space, things that define urban life but aren't on the blueprint.
And how does this contrast with non-places?
That's Mark Augier's term for spaces like airports, malls, highways, functional, transient, designed for flow, lacking deep identity or memory, sterile, interchangeable.
Third space is almost the opposite. It's about how people invest even potentially sterile spaces with meaning. Kids hanging out might turn a mall designed as a non-place into their third space. It's a critique of that flattening of experience.
So Thirdspace shows how space is never neutral.
Never. It shaped my power, yes, but constantly reshaped by people living, remembering, resisting. It helps us see beyond simple binaries and appreciate how belonging and identity are built, often in unexpected ways, within the spaces around us.
A really powerful concept to end on. It definitely makes you look at familiar places differently.
It really does.
Thank you for listening. If today's deep dive gave you something useful, consider following us on Spotify so you're the first to hear the next one. You can give suggestions by contacting on Twitter handle given in the episode description. We are always eager to hear what our listeners want to be informed about. We wish you a great day.